Move your cart, janitor. You're in the way. Those 7 words launched a quiet storm that would transform an entire company. The man they mocked as a janitor wasn't just cleaning the floors, he was the billionaire founder in disguise. When Elliot Crane returned to his own empire undercover, he uncovered a culture of cruelty, corruption, and silence at the top. What he did next shook every floorboard of the company and changed countless lives. From silent suffering to stunning redemption, this is the story of how a mop exposed the truth and how the invisible finally reclaimed their power. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Move your cart, janitor. You're in the way. The words sliced through the hallway like a blade-sharp dismissive devoid of any decency. Elliot Crane looked up slowly, locking eyes with the young executive who had barely spared him a glance. The man huffed, adjusted his Armani blazer, and strode past heels echoing like gavel strikes on the polished floor. Elliot said nothing. He didn't need to. Not yet. He pushed the cleaning cart aside and silently watched as the man disappeared into the boardroom, where Elliot's name was embossed in gold on the wall. Founder and Chairman, Crane Global Systems. That same name the man had just brushed past without recognition. Elliot wasn't here to be admired. He wasn't here for applause. He was here to see who this company really belonged to, now. Beyond the shareholder reports, beyond the public speeches, beyond the curated culture initiatives. He was here disguised as a janitor to find out what couldn't be seen from a penthouse suite. His heart beat louder than usual as he stepped into the service elevator. His reflection in the steel doors stared back. Graying beard, calloused hands, he hadn't earned a faded green uniform, a name tag that read E. Cole. There was dirt under his fingernails and sweat on his brow. For the first time in decades, Elliot Crane looked like someone the world ignored. The plan had taken shape 2 months earlier. A merger loomed on the horizon, promising massive profits but risking the soul of the company he'd built with his late wife. He'd founded Crane Global Systems in a garage with nothing but grit, sleepless nights, and a dream. But somewhere along the way, amid market expansions, acquisitions, and champagne celebrations, he'd stopped walking the floor. He stopped listening. He stopped seeing. So now for 30 days, he would become invisible. And what he'd find would either restore his faith or shatter it completely. On the first day, no one asked his name. They barely looked at him. Executives walked by as if he were a potted plant. One manager tossed his empty coffee cup into Elliot's mop bucket and said, "You people get paid to fix this mess, right?" Elliot nodded, swallowed hard, and kept pushing the cart. The office was beautiful. A pristine glass tower with biometric access, a rooftop garden, and artisan coffee stations on every floor. But something beneath the shine felt off. The smiles were forced. Laughter came in short, robotic bursts. People checked over their shoulders before speaking. Conversations dropped to whispers as Elliot approached, even when they thought he couldn't hear. But he could, and he did. By the end of the first week, Elliot had memorized more than cleaning schedules. He'd seen an executive berate a junior staffer until she cried in the stairwell. He watched a VP accidentally forward a vendor invoice to himself, then delete the email chain. But most of all, he noticed how the janitors, security guards, and cafeteria workers, those who kept the building running, were treated like ghosts. It stung. Because once upon a time, Elliot had promised this company would be different. Late Friday evening, he sat on a plastic stool in the supply room, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. He was exhausted physically and emotionally. His knees ached, his hands were blistered, and his heart was heavier than he expected. That's when Luis, the overnight security guard, stepped in. "Didn't expect to see you still here, E. Cole," Luis said with a warm smile. "Most of them clock out the minute the sun sets. Yeah, figured I'd give the floors one last pass. Place gets scuffed up fast." Luis chuckled. "Ain't that the truth? Hey, if you ever get tired of this gig, I've got a buddy at a hotel who's hiring. Cleaner hours, less suits." Elliot raised an eyebrow. That bad, huh? Luis leaned against the doorframe and sighed. Man, you didn't hear it from me, but this place used to have soul. 5, 6 years ago, everyone helped each other out. Now it's like they're all stepping over bodies to get one floor higher. That night, Elliot lay on the cot in the janitor's lounge, his private suite of shame, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the young intern who whispered "thank you" after he found her lost badge under a desk, about the older woman in accounting who limped quietly through the hallways, clearly in pain but never complained, about how many good people had become background noise in their own workplace. He began writing it all down. Every interaction, every abuse, every act of quiet kindness. By week 2, Elliot stopped being surprised by the cruelty. What shocked him more was how easy it was for people to reveal who they truly were when they thought no one was watching. One executive, Brad Withers, stood out. Arrogant, flashy, and always performing for the room. Brad walked through the office like he owned it, barking orders, making crude jokes, and calling anyone below him dead weight. One morning, Brad spilled his espresso on the marble floor and looked at Elliot like he'd murdered someone. "Well," he barked, "don't just stand there. Mop man, do I look like I clean my own mess?" Elliot stepped forward quietly, cleaning the spill, as Brad leaned against the wall, phone in hand, laughing with someone about how the janitor looked like he wanted to cry. He wasn't wrong. The humiliation wasn't what hurt. It was knowing this man now sat on the innovation committee, one that Elliot himself had once chaired. Brad was the voice shaping the future of Crane Global, and that future was rotting from the inside. Still, not everyone wore a mask. Maya, the receptionist on the 12th floor, offered him water every day. Asked his name. Smiled. Said thank you. One afternoon, she handed him a granola bar and whispered, "Don't let them get to you. Most of them wouldn't last a day in your shoes." Elliot's throat tightened. That simple gesture meant more than the $1 million deals his board flaunted. He began noticing who Maya avoided, how she always kept one ear open when Brad passed by, how her fingers trembled when she printed late reports. It was clear. She was holding something in, something dangerous. But Elliot wouldn't press. Not yet. He had to see how far the rot spread before he could begin cutting it out. On the 3rd Friday, the company held its monthly culture breakfast. Executives gathered in the glass atrium, sipping mimosas and applauding themselves for building an inclusive community. Maya wasn't invited. Neither was Luis, nor the cafeteria team who prepared the food. They watched from behind the kitchen doors while Brad delivered a speech about valuing every employee. Elliot stood in the corner holding a trash bag, absorbing every word. And in that moment, a new plan began to take shape, not just about exposing what was wrong, but about protecting what was still right. And somewhere deep inside the billionaire with a mop knew the reckoning was coming. "Hey, janitor," a voice sneered from behind Elliot, sharp and sugar-coated with cruelty. "You missed a spot." He turned quietly, mop in hand, only to see Brad Withers standing beside a group of younger executives, pointing at a pristine corner with a smug grin plastered across his face. The others chuckled, one even mimicking a sweeping motion. The laughter rolled off the marble walls like thunder in a cathedral. Elliot lowered his gaze and slowly cleaned the already gleaming corner again. Not because it needed it, but because he needed more time. More time to see who laughed, who looked away, and who stayed silent. That moment told him everything he needed to know. They weren't just arrogant. They were protected by a culture that rewarded power over principle. He had built the foundation of this company with his bare hands, and now from the ground floor he was watching the upper floors crumble in silence. He'd seen enough of the marble and mirrors side of the business. It was time to dig deeper into the engine room of the organization. The people who worked before sunrise and long after sunset. The ones who were never invited to strategy offsites or cocktail hours. That evening he made his way to the loading dock behind the building where supply trucks came and went unnoticed. It was quieter here, dirtier, real. There he met Chloe, a warehouse clerk barely out of high school trying to pay her way through night classes in computer engineering. She wore oversized gloves, a ponytail tucked under a faded baseball cap, and a look of someone who expected no help and received even less. Elliot offered to help her lift a box. She stared at him, amused. "What, you think I can't carry a case of toner, old man?" He grinned. "Didn't say that. Just figured I'd keep you from throwing your back out." She chuckled softly, and for the first time that day, Elliot heard something genuine. She let him help, and they worked in silence for a while, until Chloe spoke up again. "You're new. You don't move like the others." He raised an eyebrow. "How do the others move? Like they've given up. You look like you're still watching everything." He didn't answer, but inside her words lingered. Later that night, as Chloe stepped outside to smoke under a flickering lamp, she asked him a question he didn't expect. "Why are you really here?" There was no suspicion in her voice, just curiosity. Elliot paused. "To see something that's been hidden." She nodded as if she understood more than she let on. The days that followed were a roller coaster of revelations. In the cafeteria, he overheard a cook being scolded for using expired ingredients, not because they had no budget, but because someone in procurement had funneled the supply funds into miscellaneous spending. Elliot made a mental note of the name on the delivery invoice, Gregson D. In the tech department, he heard a software engineer whisper to another about a patch that was never deployed because the CTO's nephew had better ideas. The fix would have saved hours of productivity, but ego had outranked innovation. At night, Elliot returned to the janitor's lounge where he updated his journal like a war reporter on enemy terrain. But what he didn't expect was how deeply it would start to hurt. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was betrayal. Not just of him, but of every honest person who had poured their sweat into this company. People like Chloe, like Luis, like Maya. And yet in the middle of this decay, Elliot found quiet pockets of humanity. One morning, Maya dropped a sticky note in his supply cart. On it, in neat cursive, were 3 names. Beneath each, a short phrase, fabricated numbers. Harassment claim buried. Fired 2 whistleblowers. No explanation, no signature. But Elliot understood. She was giving him pieces, risking everything. He looked up toward her desk. She didn't look back. The following Friday, just after midnight, Elliot was mopping the elevator lobby when he saw Luis packing up his things, a cardboard box, a quiet face, a limp in his step that hadn't been there before. "What happened?" Elliot asked gently. Luis gave a weary smile. "They said they found cash missing from the petty vault. Said it was my watch shift. HR didn't even investigate." "Did you take it?" Luis stared him straight in the eyes. "I've got a kid with epilepsy, man. I work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. I'm not stealing from anyone." Elliot's chest tightened. "Who made the call?" Luis hesitated. "Brad." The name fell like a brick, and with it the last thread of Elliot's patience snapped. That weekend, Elliot used his backdoor access to the company's old internal audit system, a system he'd personally designed decades ago, and which thankfully no one had shut down. In the cold blue glow of his home office, with calloused fingers still smelling faintly of bleach, he dug through weeks of data-flagged transactions, digital trails, and camera logs. What he found made his blood run cold. Luis had been nowhere near the petty vault during the time in question, but Brad had. In fact, Brad had used his private keycard to override the vault system at 2:43 a.m., a time Luis had already signed out on the log. There was footage, time-stamped, clear as day. Elliot leaned back in his chair, breath heavy. This wasn't incompetence. It was warfare. He returned Monday morning with a fire behind his eyes. The first thing he did was find Maya in the hallway. She looked up startled. He had never approached her so directly before. "Thank you," he said softly. She blinked. "For what?" "For being brave." Her hands trembled. They said if I spoke again, I'd be next. You won't be. He walked away before she could ask what that meant. That afternoon, as Elliot scrubbed gum from the underside of the conference table, Brad leaned in and muttered, "You're lucky we let your kind clean this place, you know that?" Elliot looked up, his voice calm and steady. "Your kind," he repeated. Brad scoffed. "Useless, replaceable, built to serve." A beat passed. Elliot's eyes held him. "I built this place." Brad rolled his eyes and walked off laughing, but the smile on Elliot's face lingered just long enough, because Brad didn't know that Elliot Crane had already filed an internal whistleblower complaint under an anonymous code, or that the board had just received a copy of Luis's termination footage with a recommendation to freeze Brad's access. And in less than 48 hours, the man who mocked janitors would find out exactly who had been scrubbing his dirt from the shadows. The reckoning had begun to whisper through the halls, and no amount of marble could silence what was coming. The rain came down hard that Tuesday morning, streaking the tall windows of Crane Global like a cleansing ritual the building didn't deserve. Thunder grumbled above the city as if the sky itself were fed up with the rot festering beneath the glass and concrete. Elliot Crane stood at the corner of the lobby, mop in hand, watching the storm roll in. He hadn't slept the night before. The footage of Brad tampering with the petty vault still played on a loop in his mind, not just for the crime it revealed, but for the impunity it symbolized. How many others had been quietly discarded like Luis? How many voices silenced behind smiles and slogans? Elliot moved through the halls slower that day, not out of fatigue but out of focus, each step heavy with the weight of decision. The notebook he kept tucked beneath his cleaning cart was full now, pages fraying with ink and quiet fury. Still, he needed more than proof. He needed a pattern, a system, a story the board couldn't ignore or sweep away with a PR memo. As the afternoon sun returned, Elliot found himself in the basement archives. He pretended to wipe down the dusty metal shelves, but his eyes scanned the old expense logs, audit forms, and internal memos no one had touched in years. It was there in a yellowing file marked Vendor Contracts 2022 that he saw line after line of bloated charges approved by the same initials, DG Darius Gregson, the procurement lead, a man who smiled too often and never answered a direct question. Elliot had passed him in the cafeteria once. Darius had dropped a file folder and made a junior associate pick it up. When she'd done so, he hadn't said a word, just walked away. Elliot pulled every page that bore Darius's signature, tucking them into a folder he labeled Cleaning Supply Inventory, his quiet rebellion. The documents showed purchase orders for coffee machines that were never delivered, printer ink at 5 times the market rate, and backdoor payments to a shell logistics firm whose address led to a storage unit in Ohio. It wasn't just waste. It was theft well organized and cloaked in jargon. Elliot climbed the service stairs, mind whirling. On the 12th floor, he paused just outside Maya's desk. She was pale, typing, mechanically, lips pressed tight like she was holding something in her throat. He waited until no one was around, then slipped her a note. "Do not speak. Just nod if this name means something. Darius Gregson." He placed the paper on her desk like a receipt, nodded once, and turned. He hadn't made it 3 steps before she gave the slightest trembling nod. That evening, after most of the office had cleared out, Elliot found Maya still at her desk. He approached quietly, placing a water bottle near her elbow, as if to mask their interaction. "He's the one who got Jenny fired," she whispered. Elliot stiffened. "Who's Jenny?" "Finance analyst, young, bright. She found inconsistencies in the supplier payouts and brought them to HR. A week later, she was gone." "Did she go to the press?" "No, she had student debt and a disabled mom. They offered her a severance deal and a non-disclosure." Elliot swallowed hard. "And HR answers to Brad." That night, Elliot sat in his apartment, one of his many, though this one hadn't seen his presence in months, and stared out at the city skyline. Below him were millions of lights, some flickering, some dimmed, some already dark. He wondered how many of those lights belonged to people who were surviving in silence, people like Jenny, like Maya, like Louise, like Chloe. He opened his laptop and pulled up the file from his hidden audit system. He added Gregson's name to the top of the corruption web. Below it, a string of names formed: accounts receivable staff, legal associates, compliance officers, all with ties to falsified documents and quietly terminated employees. It was a nest, and Brad was at the center of it. But Elliot wasn't just collecting names. He was preparing a storm of his own. The next day he slipped into the cafeteria during the early morning prep. Mrs. Ida, the head cook, stood over a simmering pot of stew, her arthritic hands moving with practiced grace. He approached quietly. "Smells amazing." She glanced up, startled, then smiled. "You're that janitor who always cleans with his back straight." Elliot chuckled. "Guilty." "Most of the others move like ghosts," she said softly. You pay attention." He nodded. "And I've noticed you always stay late." Her eyes dropped. "Only way to make enough to keep my grandson in school. They cut our bonuses 3 quarters ago. Said we didn't drive profit." "Did you tell HR?" "They told me to be grateful I still had a job." Elliot's throat tightened. "You deserve better." Mrs. Ida's smile cracked. "It's a nice thought, but nice thoughts don't fix broken systems." He left her kitchen in silence, but her words echoed louder than Brad's threats ever could. That afternoon, something shifted. Elliot watched as Gregson pulled Maya into a corner conference room. The blinds were drawn, but Elliot positioned himself just close enough to read the tension on Maya's face through the glass. When she emerged 20 minutes later, she looked like someone who had stared down a firing squad. She found Elliot by the freight elevator. Her voice was barely audible. "He told me I have 2 days to withdraw my harassment report, or he'll make sure I never work in this industry again." Elliot's hands curled around the mop handle. That night, Elliot accessed the HR complaint system. He'd retained admin rights from a system upgrade 7 years ago, and clearly no one had removed them. He read through Maya's report. It was worse than he thought. Brad had cornered her twice in the mailroom. Gregson had made lewd remarks in team meetings. 2 other women had submitted reports. All 3 had been deleted. But copies were cached, and Elliot printed them all. When he arrived the next morning, he wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was a silent revolution with a trash bag full of truth. The final straw came at 4:12 p.m. Maya was called into HR and never came out. Her desk sat empty for an hour before word spread, "Maya's been terminated." They claimed she breached company policy. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline and the cleaners began their quiet work, Elliot walked through the halls of the company he built, his mop rolling behind him like a sword in a scabbard. He paused near the founder's portrait, his own face, younger eyes, hopeful. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a single call. "Activate the emergency review," he said. A pause. Full oversight. Every board member. All departments. The voice on the other end trembled. "Under what authority?" Elliot Crane stared at the company crest etched into the marble wall and smiled. "Founder's prerogative." The next morning the building hummed with the same hollow rhythm heels, clicking printers, whirring artificial laughter echoing down marble hallways. But beneath it all was a shift. A current. Unseen, yet undeniable. Elliot stood in the east corridor, leaning on his mop handle as the glass elevator rose past him. Behind the spotless transparency, Brad Withers adjusted his tie in the mirrored panel, unaware that the storm he'd unleashed had already been named. Behind Elliot's calm gaze, 30 years of leadership loss and silent loyalty pulsed like a war drum. Maya was gone. They'd erased her in less than 24 hours. No memo, no farewell, no explanation. Just an empty desk, a revoked badge, and an email bounce back that read, "This user no longer exists." But Elliot hadn't built a billion-dollar company just to watch it rot from the top down. He had fought too hard, buried too many friends, lost too much sleep. He had held his wife's hand in a hospital bed as she reminded him with her final breath, "People over profit, L. That's the only legacy that matters." He hadn't forgotten, and now neither would they. He walked into the executive stairwell, far from surveillance, pulled out his phone, and opened the encrypted app that only two people in the company had ever known about him and the late chief ethics officer, Marissa Yoon. The one department that hadn't been replaced by consultants or bought loyalty. The system still worked. He tapped a single button, Trigger Oversight Protocol A17. The screen pulsed, activated. In 72 hours, every division head, every VP, every board member would be required to submit a real-time departmental audit. No prior notice. No ability to clean house before inspection. The ethics team would comb through accounts, HR logs, surveillance, and compliance files, starting with those flagged by Elliot's silent watch. He didn't want revenge. He wanted resurrection. That afternoon, he cleaned the executive wing in silence as planned chaos was beginning to ripple across the upper echelons. It began as murmurs, then tight hallway conversations. Gregson passed by him twice, unusually jittery phone glued to his ear, the confident smirk replaced by tension around his eyes. "Something's off," Gregson muttered to a younger associate. "They're asking for document trails from last quarter. Someone's digging." "Did we get a notice?" "No, nothing. Just a sudden request for full disclosures. Financial, operational, HR, the works." Elliot kept wiping the windows invisible in all hearing. Brad's reaction came swiftly. 2 private meetings with legal, then a third, where he stormed out red-faced and visibly sweating. The way he kicked open the door and barked at his assistant, "Clear my schedule now," told Elliot everything he needed. The castle was cracking. But Elliot hadn't forgotten Luis. That evening, under the glow of street lamps outside a small boxing gym in the Bronx, Elliot waited beside a row of vending machines until Luis stepped out, gym bag slung over one shoulder, his gait still marked by the limp that hadn't healed. "Elliot?" Luis blinked, confused. "What are you doing out here?" "I need a favor," Elliot said, eyes steady. "And I owe you the truth." In a quiet booth at a corner diner, Elliot revealed everything. His name, his reason, the betrayal, the plan. Luis stared at him for a long moment, like someone reading a confession written in fire. Then he leaned back, smiled wide, and said one word, "Finally." He agreed to testify, not out of vengeance, but out of duty, and because people like Maya Chloe and Mrs. Ida deserved justice from someone who'd seen the same walls and endured the same silence. 2 nights later, Luis stood before the internal ethics team on camera sharing his account. His firing, the lack of investigation, the evidence that Brad had planted. They believed him. Not because of who he was, but because this time someone with power made sure they listened. And the more they listened, the more rot they found. Bribery, harassment, embezzlement, fear. A pattern of silencing dissenters with NDA settlements and ghost terminations. At the heart of it all, Brad Withers, and circling him like vultures, Gregson the CFO and a cabal of department heads who'd traded conscience for commission. The board was stunned, but the reckoning hadn't reached its crescendo. Elliot stood on the 17th floor balcony the following morning watching the sunrise over the river. His overalls fluttered in the wind. His mop leaned against the railing. Beside him stood Maya. She'd returned quietly through an emergency reinstatement order now under board protection. Her eyes were still wary, but she stood taller, stronger. "I never thought I'd see this day," she whispered. "It's not the end," Elliot said, "but it's a beginning." The next day, Brad Withers was called into the boardroom. He strutted in with a forced smile, thinking it was just another crisis spin he could handle with bravado. But when he stepped inside and saw all 12 board members seated, 3 federal compliance officers and Elliot Crane himself, no mop, no overalls, just a tailored suit and a steely gaze, Brad froze. "Have a seat," Elliot said evenly. Brad didn't move. His mouth opened, then closed. The boardroom was silent except for the hum of the air vents. What is this? Some kind of joke? He asked, laughter cracking like glass in his throat. No joke, said Elliot, folding his hands. Just the truth you've spent years burying. Screens lit up around the room. Footage, financial trails, HR testimonies. Maya's full report digitally restored. Luis's account time-stamped and corroborated. Brad looked around as though begging for an exit. This is insane. I've built this company's revenue projections for 3 years. And in doing so, Elliot interrupted, voice calm, you also built a culture of fear, exploitation, and fraud. You didn't raise this company. You robbed it. A long silence followed. Brad's face collapsed inward like a structure folding in on itself. You're the janitor. Elliot leaned forward. I'm the founder. Gasps murmured down the line of board members. And I've walked your halls. I've cleaned your messes. I've heard your laughter when no one else was listening. And I know exactly what you've done. The board chair, a stoic woman named Ruth Danvers, turned to Brad. Effective immediately, you're terminated. Legal action will follow. Security will escort you out. Brad, pale and shaking, stumbled backward as 2 security officers entered. As he was led out of the room, Elliot watched him go with no malice in his eyes, only gravity. A consequence earned. Outside the boardroom, workers began hearing rumors. The janitor was a billionaire. Brad was gone. Maya had returned. Something was changing. And in the cafeteria, when Mrs. Ida saw Elliot walk in wearing a suit, she dropped her ladle. He caught it midair, winked, and said, Told you? Nice thoughts can fix systems, if you're willing to act on them. She didn't speak. She just hugged him. And somewhere in a dusty corner of the company's forgotten past, the soul of Crane Global began to breathe again. The corridors that once echoed with shallow power now carried something else, uncertainty. Rumors moved like wind through cubicles and break rooms. People walked slower, spoke softer, looked over their shoulders not in fear, but in quiet reflection. Elliot Crane returned to the office the next morning, not as the janitor, and not yet as the CEO. He wore a simple gray sweater slacks and no name badge. There was no press conference, no grand reintroduction. He didn't want spectacle. What he wanted was to finish what he started. In silence, with purpose, and with eyes wide open. He took the service elevator just as he had for weeks and stepped off on the lower floor near the employee lockers. No one noticed him at first. He blended in as always. But then Luis, now in uniform again with his reinstated badge, saw him from across the hallway. Luis straightened. Their eyes met. And then with a subtle nod, Luis stepped aside and let Elliot pass, as if recognizing a king disguised once more. That day, Elliot didn't sit in a conference room. He sat beside the people. He joined Chloe down in the warehouse, rolling up his sleeves to help with incoming stock. She froze when she saw him. I thought, they said the janitor was a billionaire, Elliot offered, gently smirking. Chloe blinked, speechless. You were right, he added. I was watching. A flush of red colored her cheeks. I didn't mean anything by that, You spoke the truth. Most people don't anymore. He paused, then looked around the dusty storage unit. You deserve more than this. She swallowed hard. I'm just trying to get to next semester. I read your coursework. Maya gave me a copy. Her mouth dropped. How? I've been listening. You're brilliant. And this company needs engineers with more than titles. They need grit. You've got it. Jenna, later that week, Chloe's name would appear in the internal bulletin as the newest hire in the R&D Innovation Lab. She wouldn't believe it until she was handed her own badge and desk next to a window. But for now, Elliot simply helped unload boxes. He returned upstairs and passed the caf. Mrs. Ida caught sight of him and gave a knowing nod as if the world had quietly begun spinning in the right direction again. But beneath that warmth still festered uncertainty. Gregson hadn't shown up to work since the board meeting. The compliance team said he'd cleared out his desk at midnight, left a resignation letter, and disappeared. The others, those who'd backed Brad in his schemes, were scrambling to rewrite their stories to align with the new reality. But Elliot wasn't interested in vengeance. He was building something deeper: accountability wrapped in empathy, transformation earned through truth. And the first place he needed to begin again was with Maya. She hadn't returned to her old desk. She didn't want to. Too many shadows lingered there. Instead, she was given a private meeting room to collect her thoughts and determine her next steps. Elliot found her there late one evening, the room dimly lit, a cup of untouched tea on the table. He knocked once before stepping in. "I don't know if I should thank you or curse you," she said without looking up. He approached slowly. "Why not both?" She smiled faintly, but said nothing. "I meant it, Maya. You were brave. They don't build systems for people like you to survive, let alone stand tall. But you did." "I was terrified the whole time," she whispered. "I kept thinking, what if I speak up and it doesn't matter?" "It mattered," Elliot said softly. "It's always mattered." He pulled a small folder from under his coat and placed it on the table. Her name was printed in bold at the top. "What's this?" "Your appointment letter." She hesitated. "To what?" "Director of Internal Culture." She looked up, stunned. "You'll build the policies, shape the response teams, design the culture we say we care about. You'll have hiring authority, budget control, and direct access to me." Maya shook her head slowly, overwhelmed. I'm not qualified." "Because you don't have an MBA?" She nodded. Elliot leaned in, his voice low and fierce. "Maya, you survived what people with 10 degrees couldn't name. You stood your ground in the middle of a storm they created to break you. That qualifies you more than any title." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. Not here. Not now. Instead, she reached for the folder with trembling hands and whispered, "Thank you." He rose and stepped back toward the door. "One more thing," he said as he opened it. She looked up. "Hire Jenny back if she'll return, and give her whatever she asks for." Maya smiled. As Elliot left the room, the weight of the past weeks sat on his shoulders like wet wool. He felt the exhaustion in his bones. But deeper still, he felt something new: momentum. The next morning, the first email of the day arrived in every employee's inbox. Subject: New Vision, Same Roots. From Elliot Crane, to everyone who's been overlooked, unheard, or unseen, this company is yours again. To everyone who's taken shortcuts at the cost of others, those days are over. A company is not built on numbers. It's built on people. And we start rebuilding today. It ended with a link to an open feedback form, a video message from Maya, and the official announcement of Luis's promotion to Head of Security Integrity. The reaction was electric. Messages poured in from every floor: stories, confessions, apologies, ideas. Elliot sat at a corner table in the cafeteria, reading each submission on his tablet while sipping a black coffee served by a young man who smiled and said, "Thank you, sir. I mean that." Elliot nodded. He didn't need to say anything. The shift was happening. Later that week, as the sun broke through a slate-gray sky, Elliot stood once more in the lobby, no mop, no disguise. Just himself. A founder, a witness, a man who remembered what it was like to be invisible, and who vowed no one in his company would feel that way again. He turned to the security desk and smiled at the new team lead. "Ready to walk the floor?" he asked. Luis grabbed his tablet and nodded. "Every corner." And together they walked, not to inspect, but to listen. Because the floor always knows the truth. And this time the truth was finally being heard. The elevator doors slid open with a low chime revealing the top floor, once a palace of silence and power, now stripped of its illusions. Elliot Crane stepped out with slow, deliberate steps, the sunlight slicing through the windows and casting long shadows across the once polished floors. But today those shadows felt different. Not ominous, not towering, just human. For the first time in a decade, the executive floor didn't feel like a kingdom. It felt like a place waiting to be rebuilt. He walked past the closed office's doors, once guarded by assistants like sentinels, now left ajar, their names already peeled from the glass. Brad's office was empty. So was Gregson's. A faint outline of their titles still lingered on the frosted panes like ghosts clinging to relevance. Elliot paused outside his own office door. The last time he stood here, he had walked out in tailored armor, smiling for cameras quoted in magazines, shaking hands with people who said legacy, while hiding knives behind their backs. Now he stood in soft leather shoes and a sweater that smelled faintly of bleach and pine cleaner. He reached for the handle but didn't enter. Instead, he walked past it. The corner conference room, once a site of empty strategy sessions, had been converted into something new. The walls were lined with corkboards pinned with employee suggestions. A whiteboard displayed timelines for ethics reforms, inclusion programs, and staff-driven initiatives. There were chairs arranged in a circle, coffee mugs left without worry of judgment and laughter. Not the polished kind, but raw, beautiful laughter, drifting from inside. This was Maya's space now. She stood at the front, speaking to a group of junior hires, explaining how grievance mediation would now work, how anonymous reports would be taken seriously, and how no title in this company gives you the right to disrespect someone's dignity. Elliot lingered in the doorway unnoticed, like a proud father watching a daughter take flight. He didn't interrupt. When he finally turned back toward the elevator, he saw Chloe standing there, a box in her arms, eyes wide. "You're really him," she whispered. "The janitor was the founder." He smiled. "I was both." Her mouth opened and closed, unsure what to say. "I just wanted to thank you," she managed, "for not treating me like I was invisible." "You were never invisible," Elliot said gently. "They just weren't looking." She nodded, then held out the box. Inside was a prototype, a microchip casing she'd designed to reduce overhead energy loss in older machines. "It's a side project," she mumbled. "Just an idea." He scanned the chip, then looked back at her. "Submit it. To the committee. They'll laugh." "Not anymore." She smiled shyly. "Okay." And then she was gone off to her desk, her real desk, with purpose in her stride and something new in her eyes. Hope. The next floor Elliot visited was the cafeteria. Not during the rush, but mid-morning, when only a few scattered employees sipped tea and answered emails. He walked behind the counter and found Mrs. Ida rolling dough with steady hands. She looked up, gave him that sideways glance she'd perfected over 40 years, and smirked. "I hear you're famous now," Elliot chuckled. "Fame's not what it used to be." She pointed a floured finger at him. "You better not be one of those leaders who only shows up when there's a camera." "Never have been." She raised an eyebrow. "Even as a janitor." He paused, then met her gaze. "Especially as a janitor." She grinned, then turned back to her dough. "You know," she said softly, "after my husband died, I came back to work just to feel useful. No one ever asked why. Not once. Until you." Elliot's voice dropped. "And now I feel seen." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. She frowned. "What's this?" "A legacy award," he said. "You're the first recipient. Comes with a raise, of course, and a plaque with your name on the wall downstairs." She opened the box slowly. Inside was a silver pin in the shape of a tree growing through stone. "You earned this," he added. Mrs. Ida pressed her lips together, emotions catching in her throat, and simply nodded. He left quietly. She needed space to feel it. By noon, the building felt different. Not louder, but lighter. People who used to avoid eye contact now looked one another in the eyes. Security guards smiled. Elevators paused for someone running. Even the coffee line had patience in it. And yet, amid all this quiet healing, Elliot knew something remained unfinished. Luis, the man who had first warned him, the man who took the fall, who trusted him when he was just a stranger with a mop. Elliot found him on the mezzanine, seated beside the security console, watching cameras, reading logs. "You know," Elliot said as he approached, "I think this is the first time I've seen you still." Luis glanced up. "Comes with the title now." "You okay?" Luis leaned back. "Better than I've been in years. Still waiting for someone to tap me on the shoulder and say it was all a dream." Elliot sat beside him. "You're not dreaming. But you are building." Luis looked at the screen floor plans, real-time feeds, names of guards on shift. "Feels like I've got a second chance," he said. "You've earned it," Elliot replied, "and I need your help." "With what?" "Designing the safety systems of the future, the kind that don't just protect property but protect people, from being silenced, ignored, harmed." Luis nodded slowly. "I'll do it. Just don't ever go invisible again." Elliot smiled. "Deal." That evening, Elliot returned home for the first time in weeks, not to his penthouse, not to his guest house, but to the one place that still carried his heart, his wife's art studio. He opened the door slowly. The scent of old canvas and lavender oil greeted him like an embrace. Her last unfinished painting stood on the easel, a woman walking through fog, hand outstretched toward the light. He sat beneath it and let the silence hold him. He remembered her voice. "Don't just build buildings, Elle. Build bridges." He had forgotten that once. But not anymore. He stood up, took a fresh brush, dipped it in white, and completed the beam of light reaching toward her figure. It was small, subtle, but it was there, just like the changes in his company. Small, subtle, but real. And they were just beginning. The first snowfall of the season came early that year, blanketing the city in a hush of white silence. Flakes drifted gently down the tall glass windows of Crane Global like a blessing, or perhaps a benediction. Inside, the warmth of fresh coffee and quiet conversations hummed through the building like a melody finally finding its rhythm. But Elliot Crane felt something stirring that wasn't peace. It was time. He stood before a mirror on the 35th floor, adjusting the cuffs of his navy jacket, not out of vanity, but out of ritual. The day had come for the final reckoning. Not in secret, not hidden beneath mop buckets or silence, but in the light. In the full view of those who had once laughed, once schemed, once ruled this place with fear, polished into charm. The quarterly town hall was scheduled for 900 a.m. Normally, it was a parade of buzzwords, earnings, growth, stakeholder alignment, but not today. Today would be different. When Elliot stepped onto the stage in the grand atrium, the room fell still in a way that felt holy. Employees packed the space shoulder to shoulder. Some stood along the stairs, some leaned against pillars. Some, like Chloe and Luis and Maya, sat in the front row with backs straight and eyes unblinking. And across the room, tucked near the back, stood a handful of former executives, those who remained. Some had their arms crossed, others with notepads in hand, waiting for a script that no longer existed. Elliot looked out at the crowd. He didn't raise his voice. He simply began. "I came back here as a ghost, and no one saw me." A ripple moved through the audience. "For 30 days I swept the floors, emptied trash cans, and listened. I listened, not with power, but with humility. And what I heard broke my heart." He paused, letting silence breathe. "I heard laughter at others' expense. I saw brilliance ignored. I watched kindness punished and cruelty rewarded. I witnessed people, real people, being treated as obstacles instead of assets." A murmur of discomfort stirred. Heads nodded. A few faces turned away. "And yet," he continued, "I also saw courage. In a receptionist who refused to stay silent. In a guard who stood tall after being framed. In a cafeteria worker who kept this company fed without ever being thanked." Elliot's voice grew stronger. "Those people saved this place. Not the stock price, not the name, not the marble floors or mission statements. People. Quiet, determined, invisible people. A hush descended. The weight of truth does that. He gestured to the monitors behind him. One by one faces filled the screens. Maya, Luis, Chloe, Mrs. Ida, Jenny. Then files, documents, memos, suppressed reports. I'm not here to relive their pain. I'm here to tell you what we're going to do with it. He took a breath. Effective immediately, we are dissolving the former executive structure. Gasps. Audible now, not shock relief. We are forming an employee-led oversight council. Every floor, every department, every voice will be heard. Applause began, hesitant, then swelling. Departments once outsourced to politics will now be governed by integrity. HR will be rebuilt under Maya's leadership. Security protocols will be redesigned under Luis. Our innovation lab will be led by real minds like Chloe, people who know the ground floor because they've lived there. He stepped closer to the edge of the stage. And if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, or unworthy in these walls, I see you now, and that will never happen again. The room rose to its feet. It wasn't applause for a billionaire. It was for a janitor who chose to remember what it meant to serve. After the event, Elliot walked through the building slowly. He shook hands, hugged those who reached for him. He stopped when Jenny approached him, tears in her eyes and a folder clutched to her chest. They offered me my job back, she whispered, and I want it, but only if I can help make sure no one goes through what I did. You will, he said. That's why we need you. Upstairs, the old boardroom had been emptied. The long table replaced with smaller circles of chairs. The walls, once adorned with graphs and quarterly goals, now held portraits of the very people who'd once been erased. A black and white photo of Mrs. Ida rolling dough. A candid shot of Maya, notebook in hand, eyes burning with fire. A picture of Luis, standing alone by the freight doors at 3:00 a.m., and beneath each their stories. Not their resumes. Because resumes show titles. Stories show truth. Later that evening, Elliot returned to the rooftop garden. It had been abandoned during the chaos, flowers withered, benches covered in frost. But the city below glittered like a million tiny hopes. He sat alone on the stone bench where he used to watch the horizon with his wife. He pulled out a letter from his coat pocket, creased and yellowing. It was her handwriting. If this company ever becomes too big to feel small, you'll know what to do. He folded the letter slowly and whispered to the wind, I did it, Rose. I remembered. The wind answered with silence. But somehow it was enough. He stood gazing out over the skyline, then turned and walked back down into the building. Not as a billionaire, not as a janitor, but as something rarer, a leader reborn from humility. And behind him, the snow kept falling. Quiet, steady, pure. A new beginning covering the ground where power once reigned. And beneath it, the roots of something deeper had already begun to grow. A week after the town hall, the building felt alive in a way it hadn't in years, not because of anything grand or dramatic, but because of the small things, the kind of things Elliot Crane had once taken for granted. A group of interns sat laughing with senior engineers during lunch, no hierarchy in sight. Security officers exchanged jokes with product managers as they scanned badges. Luis had installed a community chalkboard near the lobby. People wrote gratitude notes, birthday wishes, even anonymous apologies. The air itself felt lighter. But Elliot knew that culture wasn't built in a week. Healing was not an event, it was a discipline. And the next step, perhaps the most delicate, was not to punish, but to reconstruct. There were still those who remained from the old regime, executives who hadn't committed outright harm, but had been silent, passive, complicit, and some of them were ready to speak. When Elliot entered the small conference room on the 28th floor, 3 people were waiting: Karen Sumner from compliance, Jordan Patel from marketing, and Evelyn Wu, one of the longest-serving VPs in the building. Each had a manila folder in front of them. Each looked like they hadn't slept in days. They stood when Elliot entered. "You don't have to do that," he said gently, closing the door behind him. "We do," Evelyn replied. "You listened when we didn't." Elliot didn't sit at the head of the table. He chose the side, leveled the field before a word was spoken. Karen cleared her throat. "We didn't know everything, but we knew enough. Enough to ask questions. And we didn't." Jordan nodded slowly. "We kept our heads down, focused on our departments, told ourselves it wasn't our responsibility." "And now," Elliot asked. Jordan met his eyes. "Now we want to fix it. If you'll let us." Elliot leaned forward, studying their faces, not searching for guilt, but for willingness. Not for perfection, but for change. "You can't rewrite the past," he said softly. "But you can choose what you become next." Karen slid her folder toward him. "This is everything I kept. Emails, reports, concerns that were buried. I should have spoken up." He took it without judgment. Evelyn added, "We want to build an accountability council. Voluntary. Open door. Anyone in the company can bring a concern anonymously, but it'll be staffed by people who sat in these chairs, who understand the pressure, the temptation to stay silent." Elliot smiled faintly. "You just described the antidote." They met again 2 days later, with Maya in the room and 2 newly hired ethics officers present. The council was approved, not as a performative gesture, but as a permanent structure, a place where truth would always have somewhere to go. And in the days that followed, word spread, not through press releases, through whispers, through glances, through a janitor's nod to a cafeteria worker, through an engineer placing a coffee on Luis's desk with a quiet, "Thank you." One afternoon, Elliot walked past a break room where Chloe was helping an older employee set up a presentation on a smart screen. The man Harold had been with the company since the fax machine era. His hands trembled as he held the remote. "Just press here," Chloe said gently. "You got this." Elliot paused outside watching. She didn't know he was there. That made it better. Harold clicked the button. His presentation filled the screen. His eyes lit up like a boy watching a rocket launch. "See?" Chloe beamed. Elliot walked on. Every floor he passed was proof dignity restored itself in silence. Still, there were hard days. An anonymous email accused a middle manager of retaliation. A former employee posted a scathing thread online, some of it exaggerated, some heartbreakingly true. The stock dipped temporarily. Investors asked questions Elliot had no neat answers for. But for every loud critic, there were 10 quiet builders, and Elliot believed in the builders. Late one evening, he found Maya standing alone by the lobby windows watching the snow fall again. She held a folder in her arms, but she wasn't reading it. She was just standing. "Hard day?" he asked, approaching gently. She nodded. "Someone told me today that I only got this role because of sympathy. Someone unqualified. No, someone scared. Of change." He stepped beside her. "The people who say that often confuse power with purpose." Maya looked up at him. "Was it always like this?" "When you started?" "No. When I started, I was poor, hungry, and too stubborn to fail. We had no space for cruelty. Every voice mattered. Then we grew. And somewhere along the way we stopped listening. Not out of malice, out of momentum." She took a breath. "What if I mess this up?" "You will," he said, smiling. "And then you'll fix it. That's leadership." She let out a laugh, soft and tired. He looked out at the city lights. "I used to think this building would be my legacy. And now," he turned to her, "now, I hope you are." The next morning, Maya announced the launch of the Listening Initiative, a quarterly tour across all departments. No agenda, no slides, just leaders sitting and listening, like Elliot had, with a mop in his hands and his heart wide open. In the first session, a shipping clerk named Marisol stood up and said something that would become etched in the building's DNA. "I used to feel like I was just a name on a schedule. Now I feel like a name in a story." Elliot, listening from the back row, felt something deep inside shift. Not pride, gratitude. That evening he returned to the founder's office, not to reclaim it, but to pack it up. He left the family photos, the painting his wife had made, but everything else, plaques, awards, citations. He boxed, quietly. Luis came to help. "You sure about this?" he asked gently, closing one of the drawers. Elliot nodded. "This space belongs to someone else now." "Who?" "Someone who still has everything to prove." They turned off the lights. And as the city blinked beneath them, Elliot felt the peace of a man who had finally let go of power and held on to purpose instead. The following Monday began with silence. Not the tense, stifling kind that used to settle over the building like fog, but the kind that precedes something meaningful like the hush before an orchestra's first note. At 8:30 a.m., the newly established Employee Oversight Council convened for its first official session. The room wasn't glamorous. It wasn't meant to be. It was a converted storage space on the 6th floor with long tables, mismatched chairs, and a whiteboard covered in handwritten notes from all corners of the company. There was no CEO at the head. No one sat higher than anyone else. And that, more than anything, was the point. Elliot Crane sat in the back corner, not to lead but to observe. Maya opened the session with a quiet but steady voice. "We're not here to fix everything today. We're here to listen. And from listening, we'll learn. And from learning, we'll build." She gestured to the open floor. The first to speak was an IT technician named Jerome, who had once been passed over for promotion 4 years in a row despite glowing performance reviews. He spoke not with bitterness but with clarity. About systems that favored familiarity over merit, about the way some doors only opened if you already had a key. Next was a woman from facilities named Lila, who shared how her night shift team often felt forgotten, never invited to events rarely acknowledged in internal announcements. Then came Rafi, a young marketing associate who simply said, "I've never felt safe being fully myself here. I want to, though." Their voices weren't polished. They weren't strategic. They were honest. And that honesty carried more weight than any press release ever could. Elliot sat with his hands folded, heart full, eyes bright. Every sentence he heard was a piece of the company's soul finding its way back. When the meeting ended, Maya walked up to him, the weight of the morning heavy in her posture. "Was that what you hoped for?" she asked. "No," Elliot replied. "It was more." She smiled, and for the first time in a long while, it reached her eyes. That afternoon, Elliot met Chloe in the Innovation Lab, a glass-walled space once reserved only for directors and senior engineers. Now it was bustling with voices, young and old ideas flying across whiteboards like sparks. She was presenting her energy efficiency prototype to a group of skeptical investors. Elliot watched from a distance as she answered every question, clarified every detail, never once shrinking beneath their gaze. She wasn't just smart. She was unshakable. After the pitch, he found her at the water cooler. "You held your ground," he said. "They tried to poke holes. They always will. But this time," she said, smiling, "I had the numbers, and I had the floor." He nodded. "You've got more than that now. You've got a voice." That week, Chloe's prototype was fast-tracked into the company's sustainability initiative, with her leading the pilot implementation. The girl who once hauled toner boxes now carried entire departments forward. Meanwhile, Luis was walking a different path. As head of security integrity, he'd begun hosting weekly ground walks, quiet strolls through the building with no agenda, just him and 2 team members stopping to speak with anyone who made eye contact. He believed safety started with presence, not policy. One day he stopped outside the cafeteria where Mrs. Ida stood wiping a table. "Everything good today?" he asked. She smiled, tired but warm. "Better than it used to be." He looked down at the mop in her hand, then up into her face. "You ever think of retiring?" She chuckled. "And leave you all to ruin the coffee again? Not a chance." But then she paused. gaze softening. "I might, though. Soon." Luis nodded. "When you're ready, we'll throw a party so big they'll hear it on Wall Street." She winked. "Just don't let them mess up my gumbo recipe when I'm gone." As the week closed, Elliot found himself walking through the halls more often, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. He spoke to a new hire on her first day. He helped restock the supply closet. He held the elevator for a junior designer carrying mock-ups under his arm. He had never felt more like a part of the company than he did now. But there was still one more thing he needed to do. On Friday evening, he returned to the rooftop garden. The snow had melted into puddles, and beneath it the first buds of spring were pushing through the soil. They were small, almost invisible, but they were there. He brought with him a small wooden box. Inside it, a bronze plaque. He knelt by the flower bed, brushed the soil aside, and placed the plaque into the ground. It read, "In honor of the invisible ones who kept this place alive when no one was watching." He didn't cry, but his throat tightened, because he remembered every face. The cleaner who hummed to herself while wiping down glass. The security guard who stood in the cold without complaint. The receptionist who never let her kindness be crushed. The girl who carried boxes while building algorithms in her head. The cook who fed the building with food and dignity. And the janitor he'd become long enough to remember what leadership really meant. He stood and wiped his hands, brushing the dirt from his fingers. Behind him, the door opened. It was Maya. "I saw you come up here," she said. "You always did pay attention," he replied. She joined him, eyes falling to the plaque. "It's perfect," she whispered. He looked out over the skyline. "We're not done." "No," she said. "We're just getting started." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting gold across the rooftop, Elliot and Maya stood side by side in silence. Not as CEO and employee, not as billionaire and survivor, but as people. Builders, listeners, restorers. And beneath their feet, something quiet, steady, and beautiful was growing again. The first anniversary arrived quietly. There were no banners, no fireworks, no champagne flutes clinking in executive lounges, just a quiet, handwritten note placed on every employee's desk before sunrise. "You are the reason this place breathes. Thank you for never giving up. E.C." It was Chloe who found it first. She ran her fingers across the ink like it was something sacred, then tucked it into the corner of her monitor. Luis read his copy 3 times before folding it once and slipping it into his wallet next to a photo of his daughter. Maya didn't need to read it. She recognized Elliot's script immediately and smiled to herself, knowing he had probably delivered every note by hand. And he had. At 4:15 a.m., Elliot Crane had walked the halls alone, just as he had on that very first day in disguise. No cameras, no witnesses. Just his footsteps echoing down polished corridors, now filled with light instead of fear. Each desk he passed held a memory, a conversation, a moment of truth. Each corner had once held shadows. Now they held life. Later that morning, Elliot entered the atrium. It looked different now, warmer. Framed photos lined the walls. Moments of real joy, an intern presenting their first idea, a security officer reading to a child during a family visit, a janitor smiling beside a vice president at a community garden they built together. At the center stood a tall bronze sculpture of a hand holding a seedling rising from cracked concrete. The plaque read, "From the ground we rise." Maya joined him beneath it. "Do you remember where we were a year ago today?" she asked softly. He nodded. "I was wiping coffee off marble. You were being silenced." "And now?" Elliot looked around the room. "Now we're planting things that won't die when the cameras turn away." She nodded, her eyes scanning the crowd that had begun to gather, employees holding coffee, whispering, laughing, their body language no longer tight with caution, but open, relaxed. Trust had returned. Not perfectly, but steadily. And then, without any script or schedule, Luis stepped onto the small platform near the sculpture and cleared his throat. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice deep and grounding. I just wanted to say something." The room quieted. "A year ago I thought I was done. I thought honesty had cost me everything. But someone believed in me when no one else would. And that belief rippled through this place like a tide. Some of you don't even know how much you helped just by showing up every day, by staying kind when it was easier to turn bitter. So, yeah, happy anniversary. Let's keep building." There was no applause at first, just stillness. Then it came, loud, full, not out of obligation, but from something real, something earned. Elliot felt the swell of emotion rise in his chest. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The voice of the company no longer belonged to him. And that was the greatest success he could have ever hoped for. Instead, he slipped away from the crowd and found himself back in the janitor's closet on the first floor. It hadn't changed much. A few new supplies, a fresh coat of paint. But the smell of pine cleaner and honest labor still lingered. On the shelf was a worn uniform, his old one, the one with E. Cole stitched above the heart. He reached out and touched it. So much had begun here. Not with a board meeting, not with a buyout, but with a mop. And a decision. To see again. To hear. To feel. Behind him the door creaked open. It was Chloe. She held something in her hands, a small metal box. "I found this in storage," she said. "Thought you'd want it." He took it, fingers brushing hers. Inside was a time capsule he had forgotten he buried 25 years ago, meant to be opened when the company hit its 100th employee. Inside, an old photo of him and his wife in their garage holding the first prototype of their software. A note she had written, sealed in a blue envelope. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. The paper inside was yellowed. The ink faded, but her handwriting still danced across the page. "Elle, if you're reading this, it means you made it. But I hope, more than anything, you never forgot why you started. The world will try to change you, but don't let it harden you. Build with love, lead with listening, and if you ever lose sight of what matters, become small again. The answers live in the quiet places." He folded the letter and placed it against his chest. Chloe said nothing. She just stood with him in the silence. Finally he spoke. "Do me a favor. Anything. When you lead this place one day, and you will don't forget the janitor's closet." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "Never." He placed the uniform back on the hook. That afternoon, a car waited for him at the curb. Not a limo, not black-tinted glass, just a silver sedan with Maya at the wheel keys dangling from her finger. "You ready?" she asked as he climbed in. "Where are we going?" "To visit the community school you funded. The kids painted murals this week. They want you to see them." He smiled. "Let's go." As they drove off, employees spilled out for their lunch break. The building shimmered in the winter light not just because of its design, but because of its soul. It had been rebuilt from the bottom up, not with money, but with memory, with courage, with dignity, and with one man who dared to disappear just long enough to see everything clearly. Elliot Crane didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the company would stand, because it no longer stood on his name. It stood on theirs, and for the first time in a long, long while, that was more than enough. Sometimes it takes stepping into the lowest place to truly see what's broken at the top. Elliot Crane had every reason to remain in comfort, detached from the cracks beneath his empire. But instead he chose humility over ego, silence over spotlight service, over power. And in doing so, he rediscovered the soul of his company. What began as an undercover act of observation became a movement of transformation, not through punishment, but by listening, lifting and lighting a path forward. This story reminds us, titles don't make leaders, actions do. Dignity belongs to everyone, not just those with offices and plaques. And the quiet voices, Janitors, security guards, cafeteria workers, young innovators often carry the deepest wisdom. So whether you're at the top or just starting out, never underestimate the power of kindness, truth, and walking the halls with open eyes. The smallest gesture, the choice to see someone as human, can spark a revolution. Because true leadership doesn't begin when you're seen, it begins the moment you choose to see.